Recording started. It's all yours.
All right. Well, good evening. I'm Jim Lane, and joining me is Ryan Rominger, and we're going to be talking about narrative research methods and narrative inquiry tonight. We're excited about that. My background in my interest in narrative inquiry is in education and ed leadership, and Ryan's is in psychology. So Ryan will be talking about that tonight, and I will be talking about applications as I've seen them. So let's go. And Ryan, did you have any introductory words to say?
Welcome to the Narrative Inquiry webinar. I'm glad that you made it. And yeah, my background, as Jim said, was in psychology and narrative research and psychology. So I look forward to the evening.
So as do I. So we open with a general description by Clandon and Connolly. Narrative inquiry, the study of experience as story, is first and foremost a way of thinking about experience. And that really is what narrative is in its many forms, telling stories in a way of thinking about experience. And for me personally, I think stories are very powerful. And we learn a lot about ourselves and a lot about other people and about the culture by studying individual stories, and it can take many forms. And of course, narrative inquiry has been around, honestly, for a couple of thousand years in studying the stories of the culture. And Clandon and Connolly primarily come out of the education field, so I refer to them a lot, but they've been pioneers in the area as well. So this is our agenda. We've had our introductions. We're going to talk to you about some key texts, key resources that we use. We have the birth of narrative. Narrative grows up and establishes a commune. This is Ryan's wording. I appreciate that. We're going to give you three examples of things we've worked with. There could be many examples. It's just some of the stuff we've done. Talk about some of the challenges and advantages of narrative, and certainly there are many. Trying to distinguish narrative from other qualitative methods, and that can get a little fuzzy. And then questions, and we have some references at the end. So,
comment about the birth of narrative and narrative growing up. What I was trying to do there was just demonstrate to everybody using a narrative method and describing narrative at the same time. It's essentially telling the story of how narrative research in particular came about. So I hope you enjoy it. It's meant as a little bit of humor instilled in there.
I love it. All right. So some key text. Ryan, the first one was one you posted.
Yeah, that's 5 ways of doing qualitative analysis, and you have a number of different types of analysis that are discussed within this book. What they do that's different in this book is they all take one interview and text and analyze it from the 5 different methods, so you can see how it's different depending on the method. I referenced this same book in our phenomenology webinar. So if you've seen it before, that's probably why. I think it's a fun text to read and would recommend it for those that are starting out.
Great. And I would argue that anyone who's interested in narrative inquiry, and especially if someone's going to write an article or even more importantly, write a dissertation, this would be a good library to start with. And there's really no way around reading in the field and understanding. I would say most of these are going to give you a pretty good deep dive into the history of narrative and methodology. This first is a book that I especially like. It's Qualitative Research by Saldana, and he talks about a lot of things, including narrative inquiry. The second one is one of the landmark books by Clandon and Connolly in 2000. And although they had written things before, this is kind of a landmark work and launched a lot of other things. Clandon has continued to write more. I don't know if, honestly, I don't know if Connolly retired or if he's still around, but Clandon is still active and doing research. Understanding Narrative Inquiry, this book I just got, I really like. It's a good introduction, and it's a brand new book. The next one, Reisman. Reisman is another pioneer in the field. She comes out of, I think she comes out of other social sciences. She doesn't come out of education. I think she may come out of psychology, Ryan. I'm not sure. Coming to Narrative by Art Bachner. This is something that I discussed when I talked about the autoethnography in the autoethnography webinar. But it talks about Bachner, who came from a quantitative background to narrative and telling stories. Cole and Knowles is the next book. Again, they're pioneers in oral history and life story. A little different turn on narrative. It's important to see. Visual Methodologies in its 4th edition. It's a good overview of visual methodologies. The next, of course, is Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research, which really you need. Sorry, but you need that if you're going to do qualitative work. It's a good start. And then Clendenin edited Narrative Inquiry. That's I think 2000. Well, I'm not sure what the copyright is, so I won't say. But anyway, these are all good things to have. And Ryan?
There's also journals out there that can be useful. For example, Narrative Inquiry, the journal. And this link, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click on the link, and it takes you to an issue that is specific on storytelling within the digital age. And I just use that as an example of the types of issues that this journal will have, and you can go to the journal, or there's a number of other qualitative journals that have articles about using narrative research methods or narrative inquiry, but this one's focused on narrative inquiry.
Good. And it's important to note, some of us are in the middle of a dissertation and publication workshop, and find out if you have a journal that you're interested in, find out if they do publish narrative inquiry, because not everyone does. There are a lot of qualitative journals, and they'll publish it. Also, if you go to the website, the Methodological website, we do have qualitative sources there as well. So this is a good resource. Okay.
So this is meeting the parents of Mr. or Mrs. Narrative. If you think of narrative as a character, really, narrative comes out of philosophically the phenomenology and hermeneutics background. Some of this you saw again going back to the phenomenology presentation that was given. For those of you who didn't see it, it is recorded. You can go back to the research methods SIG web pages and watch those different videos, and there's a video on phenomenology there. So you'll hear more in depth about this. But essentially, phenomenology from Husserl, hermeneutics from Heidegger. Phenomenology talks about universalism and objectivism. Hermeneutics really is more contextual, subjective. Heidegger talks about the thrownness of the individual. That means the person within the context. And focuses more on interpretation and making meaning as people engage the world. And so you can see where narrative would be connected to that interpretive meaning-making process. Close cousin to narrative is linguistic analysis. You have Gadamer and Ricoeur, who are both influential there. Because hermeneutics is about looking at how people communicate, there's an overlap there with different types of linguistic analysis. And then narrative emerges from this philosophical soup. You have Polkinghorne and a variety of others. I didn't put everybody there because in some sense, like Schiff talks about the different areas with that the narrative turn emerged within. For example, there's the linguistics branch of narrative. There's the social sciences branch of narrative research. So there's these different branches, and each branch has its own people that it points back to for the philosophical roots. And depending on the type of narrative you're using, you really want to delve into that, especially those that are doing dissertations. Make sure to read and steep yourself in those roots of that tradition. Polkinghorne is one that a lot of them all point back to, so I did mention Polkinghorne, and we're going to talk about Polkinghorne in a little bit. And also the mesosystem that this newborn baby called narrative is growing up within. It is linked to constructivism philosophically. And people construct meaning of the experiences that they have. They also co-create or co-construct it between themselves and their surroundings, between themselves and others. Thus, narrative research recognizes both the participants' creation of reality and meaning and the researcher's creation of reality and meaning through the analysis of the participants' shared stories. And that's important to remember, that as a researcher, you're not just using narrative methods to study the story of your participants. You also have to remain aware that you are constructing, from a constructivist perspective, you're constructing that narrative and the meaning of what your participants are sharing with you. All right. It's not about generalizing by and large. It's about the story and the lived experience of the individuals that you're talking about within that particular context that is the person is in relationship to. Jim, did you want to jump in, or do you want me to keep going?
Go ahead, but I just would reinforce we're going to revisit all of these concepts, so this is just a perfect overview. Yeah, go ahead.
So a narrative continued to emerge from, again, from these roots and has relationships to ethnography. Maybe it's a cousin or aunt or uncle, to continue the metaphor. But there's quite a bit of overlap. In many sense, the study within ethnography looks at the meta-narrative that a person is within, that social context that a story is happening in, whereas a lot of narrative research, on the other hand, is focused on the individual. And what's the individual's story, the individual's experience with a particular phenomenon, and their story of being in relationship to that phenomenon. The meta-narrative that is related at the ethnographic level, often people talk about a group's truth as their lived experience. And so that's how you know you're in that meta-narrative kind of ethnographic area. There's also a renewed focus on qualitative methods in all the scientific endeavors, which allowed narrative to continue to grow and become stronger. Qualitative research in general has gained a lot of ground in the last 20 years, and narrative continues to grow within that strengthening of the overall qualitative research methods. In psychology, we see narrative show up as a response in some ways to cognitive psychology and CBT. Narrative is seen as a response because there's an awareness of an individual's identity and self as a narrative. We have our own story of our construct of ourself based on our history, our present, and where we hope to go in the future. And that kind of narrative, that storyline, helps us identify who we are in the world, whereas cognitive often breaks down into pieces, breaks our thought process in different ways down into different elements. And so in many ways, narrative is a response to that. Another thing that has been happening is art-based research has become very influential within the research endeavors, different social sciences. And narrative is very much aligned with art-based research in that you're trying to get to that underlying meaning and story. They have some of the same roots and some of the same feel. We'll get back into that in a little bit.
Great. So shall I go?
Yep, go ahead.
And so, well, I'm fumbling here because narrative can take many forms. Narrative inquiry can go many ways. We're going to kind of see that. Various combinations of theory, practice, and personal experience, absolutely. This comes from Kim, which is one of those books referenced above. Hold on, please. Sorry. Anyway, so she's saying that narrative cannot exist in a vacuum. We can't make sense of the stories without the help of the theory or intersection of multiple theories. So we're going to see a contradictory comment in a minute, but theories are there to inform us or guide us, to help us understand a story. But the important thing is the theory should not cloud us so much that we don't see the story there. the story is the message, and we may start out with a theory or a framework, but if we see things that contradict that, we need to listen to the individual story and not let the framework cloud what is really there in front of us. Theories, they're there to help us, to be used not to dictate or shape our stories. Just a few. I mean, there are many, but critical theory, critical race theory, feminist theory, LGBTQ are some recent theories that have gained prominence, and each of those would look at stories through a particular lens. And again, that's good, that's fine, and there are many others, you know, and certainly from each field, from ed leadership and certainly psychology or whatever, there are different lenses, different theories. So it's important I think it's good. I like to start with that, but as we'll say in a minute, once we get into the data, be ready to change. Right, so this is Clendenin and Connolly, and they actually are not. Good. And they make a distinction with theory. They come down kind of light on the place of theory, saying that it differs from more formalistic inquiries. They want to begin with experience as the story. It's more productive to begin with explorations of the phenomenon rather than in comparative analysis of various theoretical methodological frames. So Clendenin and Connolly are kind of on the light end of theory. I think they appreciate that, but they were looking for the deep dive of experience, and that's why it's important to read thoroughly if you're going to do something like this. Go ahead.
So what is narrative research method? Narrative research methods or narrative inquiry, as we were talking about, analysis of a person's story, of an experience that they have had. The goal of the researcher is to draw out that story from the participant, and the story can be told in many different ways. It doesn't just have to be through this interview format. You can get journals, you can have visual symbols, you can use a lot of different ways and artifacts to help flesh out what is the story that that person is telling, or the narrative that that person is telling about the experience that they've had. As a researcher, you may create vignettes of each story that you collect. You may create one overarching meta-narrative that includes all the main aspects of the shared stories, like if there's universal aspects throughout. You might find that your results are coming out as a story that's depicted through imagery or a fictitious story or play that demonstrates the main gist of the narratives in order to convey it, even though it's considered a fictional story. It might still have the elements that, as a researcher, you found within your participants. And you might even identify main themes that you found within the narrative. So the output of narrative research can look very different depending on how you're engaging, what your goals are, and you know, the way that you're constructing the understanding that you got from that study. In many ways, the narrative research methods or narrative inquiry is one of the loosest methods, and there are many different ways of approaching the analysis and the presentation of the results.
And I would just add, Ryan had vignettes there, and often one might find oneself writing vignettes of the individual stories to create the narrative experience. So you have to be willing to do a deep dive and be willing and able to write that.
So Schiff talks about narrating as opposed to narratives. So the word narrative is a noun, and you might point towards, you know, the interview that we have. You know, you're pointing to the text and saying there's a narrative. But there's also the verb narrating, and looking at what's the narrating process that a person goes through as they're telling a story. And he says that narrating is really making present. And these two quotes from Schiff. He says, as I see it, the foundational property of narrating is to make present. This is narrating's primary function. And making present is three things: declarative, temporal, and spatial or social. It's declarative in that it makes present it gives presence to the subjective experience. And this is another way to say it gives, highlights or showcases the voice of that individual, and their story. It's temporal in that it gives meaning to the past, present, and future of that individual or individuals. And it's spatial or social in that it really showcases or co-creates the shared and divergent understandings of the world. There can be many different types of narrative. Here are a few of them. There's discourse analysis, again, going back to that. There's an intersection of linguistic analysis, which is different than discourse analysis, and the use of story or analyzing elements of a participant's story, such as the introduction, rising action, climax, and resolution of their story. There's quote-unquote standard narrative inquiry, which is often seen as interviewing people and pulling out themes or vignettes. There's visual narrative analysis, photo elicitation, which is using a picture to elicit a story that a person might have if they're remembering an event. There's art-based research methods, types of narrative, and many more.
And you might, if I could just go back to that for a minute in terms of the discourse and linguistic analysis. If one is pretty well schooled in English language and grammar, you might tackle that. That could be what patterns does one see in all kinds of things: phrasing, verbs, nouns, capitalization. What patterns does one see? You might even think of a content analysis, where one approach, you might even count the number of units, whatever it is that you're counting, the number of times a person uses all caps, or gerunds, or just anything, whatever you would say. And then you could, in the discourse, you could do more of a deep dive as to what does that mean. So that's where you're really looking at the syntax and the construction of the language. And there's a lot of power in that. I would say that often we don't see that in the dissertations that I've seen or the articles that I've seen. It's pretty intense, but that is one version of narrative analysis. So go ahead. And what? Just different, what do we have here? Right.
This is Kim and the different genres.
Just different genres, and it can be kind of blurry. Of course, I talked about autoethnography a few weeks ago, and autoethnography is personal analysis of oneself, ethnography of oneself. Autobiography is telling a story, not quite as analytical. Again, we said life stories, oral history. I mentioned the Cole and Knowles book, and when we looked at the resources earlier, and they've written a lot on that. And there's a lot of power in that. And actually, it's one of my goals is to dig into some of my past to do some narrative inquiry regarding that. Of course, Eisner has done a lot of work with arts-based inquiry, and again, creative nonfiction and storytelling, and that's really a different approach. And not everyone can do that, but it can, where you can take fiction or nonfiction and go from there. And even when I think of nonfiction, I think of even things like Truman Capote and Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe. We're kind of getting into pop culture there, but that's how creative nonfiction can work as well in narrative. And we're going to talk about visual-based narrative in a minute. And I guess I'm going to talk about one, and Ryan's going to talk about the other. I liked this Polkinghorne dichotomy. I don't know if dichotomy is the right word. That's not the right word, but description, perhaps. And he turns things around: analysis of narratives versus narrative analysis, kind of playing with words. And really, in the first one, maybe is what we might see more often in the studies I've worked with here at Phoenix. Concepts, again, from previous theory. You start with a frame or theory, logical possibilities, a predetermined foci of your study, so you kind of know where you're going, and then you inductively find concepts from the data. Similar to grounded theory. I'm not saying it's grounded theory, but same kind of concept, and inevitably change, as I said. Start with the frame, the conceptual framework of the theory, but then the data must talk to you, and you tease things out of that. They'll speak to you, and so that's different. That's a paradigmatic mode of analysis. And I hadn't seen that term other places, but I like that. I thought it framed pretty well what we often see in our research.
And the one that I tend to see more often is more of the narrative analysis or narrative mode of analysis, which in my experience is more holistic, you instead of getting into the micro or the coding and theming of the data, you're looking at larger stories. What's the and creation of vignettes and meta narratives? You know, what's the overarching story that this person is presenting? And Jim and I were talking about that might be a piece of that might be my work within psychology as opposed to his work within education. You know, it might show up differently in different areas, potentially. I can see where both would be valuable in both areas. But in narrative analysis, again, going back to Polkinghorne, the configuration of the data in a coherent whole while sustaining the metaphoric richness of the story. And the purpose is to help the reader understand how and why things happened in the way they did, and why and how participants acted in the way they did. So again, that thrownness, going back to hermeneutics, you know, the contextualization, what's the social influences and why did they happen?
And this is just an overview. We're not going to get too much into this, but I think people are generally familiar with this concept. This is a diagram from Kim that I especially liked. So just a definition of codes, identifying concepts from the data, categories, linking codes, themes, creating a theme that represents patterns, and patterns, repeated units. So, you know, there are a lot of people to read about that. Saldana talks a lot about coding. He may be the go-to person for coding and understanding this. So it's just a quick look at that, and it could apply to a lot of qualitative data analysis. So we're going to look at an example here in a minute. Okay.
And then there's more of a broad stroke holistic analysis. So whereas here we're talking about codes and theming, here in the broad stroke, more holistic analysis, you're looking at larger patterns. And for doctoral writers, you want to imagine themselves to be, or they imagine themselves to be writing a generalizable document in which the threads constitute generalizations and participants fade into support roles. This kind of reduction, a reduction downward to themes rather than upward to overarching categories, as in the formulistic, yields a different kind of text with different role for the participants. And again, that's Clandinin and Connolly. You know, it's just a different way of looking at it, whether it's more, I guess you could even say top down versus bottom up, or holistic, you know, kind of the 10,000-foot view of what's the narrative, as opposed to really getting down into the specific elements.
And back to Clandinin and Connolly, with kind of the 10,000-foot view, a lot of the research Clandinin has done has been spending a lot of time, specifically with teachers. So they may take a project that lasts a year of interacting in the field with a few teachers. And so, you know, it's not something as simple as you know, a questionnaire and asking, you know, 12 questions and you know, in 45 minutes you're done. This is what they do. So this is her view. Not everybody's going to do that. That's very time consuming. And regarding a dissertation, I think that'd be a powerful dissertation, but one would really have to understand the commitment for that. They have a metaphor that they, and we've seen these references before, earlier, regarding time and space. They call this three-dimensional space. They say they take that from Dewey, who believed in the power of experience in education. So Dewey's terms are interaction, situation, and continuity, and they say that these overlap. And when one is I was going to say examining, that's not the right word, trying to understand and represent life stories. Interaction, one must keep in mind the personal and the social. That Dewey says, you know, we interact on both levels, personally inside ourselves and then socially with others, inward and outward, inside reflective and then outward socializing. Continuity, the past, present, and the future. Sometimes, as we know, they're with us all at once. So one has to understand that we enter stories at a point in time, and there's been something that happened before, and there's something that will happen, continues to happen, so backward and forward. And then situation, place is very important, and how the place in the past, the place in the present, place in the future. So not to get too abstract, but these are the kinds of things, and especially the narratives that Ryan is talking about, they have all of these factors of personal, place, and time. Temporal is the term that we used earlier. Same thing, right? Good. And this is just a graphic. The hermeneutic approach is to re-examine and reinterpret continually. So we have a story. We take the accounts of the story. We have our field texts, our documents, whatever they are, notes, letters, other documents, photographs, pictures. Clendenin and Connolly have what they call memory boxes, where people can put, there are all kinds of things that can tell part of our story. And then it's modified through re-examination, as we know, as the person considers the story, relives the story may change, and then as we recursively examine what we have, that changes. So, and we recreate the story. So you could actually have a wheel where you have a recursive process of hearing the story, reading the data, reprocessing, and recreating it. So, and this is something, so I don't know if Liz Johnston is here, but this is a study that Liz and I just worked on. It's an example of a framework where Liz is an artist, graphic artist, visual artist. I'm not. But so Liz had a study, a framework regarding the value that an arts education has on students, and how education founded in the arts instruction teaches persistence and creativity and insight and all kinds of things. So we started with that premise, but then Liz had interviewed several artists, people who are professional. They had an arts background and they did other things, but they continued with their art, and they were accomplished artists, and they were accomplished in another field as well. And so that was our purpose, was kind of find out how that art had influenced the trajectory of their lives. And so through that, we modified the framework that we started with. And this is just kind of what we came up with. You know, we don't have to know the details of that, but you know, we just saw it. I mean, I think some of the things we started with were observation and persistence and vision and reflection, but we added to that. And then as we read the data, we saw other things come out. And it was just a recursive process of reading and rereading and talking and going back to the data. And that really is part of it, part of this process. So, and on the next slide, we just have an example of color coding. And of course, this is manual color coding. Of course, things like Deduce and NVivo let you do this through the platform. And you know, the advantage of that is you can house those, file those in different ways. But just a quick example of something we used, where we took phrases and then we were able to color code them, and then we'd take notes. You know, another process of this is to take reflective memos and notes continually as you have questions, if you have insights, and all of those go into helping you reframe your framework and craft your study and help you shape your results and discussion. So just a quick example of that. We're going to look at some examples. So that was example one. Another example of visual narrative inquiry, looking at the commonplace, common things. Making visual narrative research draws on this use of still photography often to evoke memory in our lives, around which can reconstruct life stories. And you know, if you've ever had the experience probably of looking through a box of old pictures, you know how that works. So we're going to look at a quick example of something that I've worked on. Saldana, again, every artifact evokes a possible story of its history. explanatory purpose for its presence. We put these together into a larger picture of a participant's local world, suggests a variety of emotional, affective human beings connected to the objects. So not the objects themselves, but again, the stories, the emotions, values that these objects may trigger or may represent. So we're going to look at some examples of that. Dewey, again, Clendenin and Connolly go back to Dewey, and a lot of other researchers do. Dewey thought understanding the aesthetic is important, but one must begin in the raw, in the basic events of man, ordinary experiences of the sources which give rise to experience. And we take things for granted, but this is what visual inquiry does for us. We're able to take things that we regard as common, as ordinary, and realize that they aren't, and they hold a lot of power and value for us. So again, we're going to look at that. So this is Saldana. It's just a model that I like, he's talking specifically about visual inquiry here, but I think it applies to all narrative inquiry. He talks about manifest, these are his terms, manifest, things that are observable, holistic, that we see right on the top, on the surface, and latent, of course, all kinds of things that are hidden, experiences that we may or may not know about, the past, the present, and future again. We've heard that several times, temporal. Value system, he talks about how values can be reflected through objects, through structures. They can reflect values, attitudes, beliefs, things they've been used for, they interact with a person and they reflect the culture in which the person interacts. And then big ideas, they can represent big ideas, culture, identity, politics, power, and symbols. And so objects can represent all of these things. And we're going to get just an example of some things I've looked at. Go ahead. So again, Saldana, and he's talking visual, but it's true for all, really, it's probably true for all qualitative analysis and certainly narrative. Researchers, we're like cameras, and our eyes are like lenses. The way researchers perceive social life can be influenced, affected by our own significant demographic attributes, such as gender, age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, occupation. And of course, we think of that theoretical lens that we talked about earlier. We have to be aware of that, and that's part of the to kind of blur into phenomenology. It's part of that bracketing aspect of understanding that and realizing that. And this argument is you can't get rid of it. You just have to understand that it's there, and try to understand how it reflects, how it shapes your interpretation. So the idea of the camera. So this is something, and just regarding that lens, this is a photograph of my in-laws' farm. And so I took this photograph, and there are going to be two different photographs, but although these are seemingly commonplace items, I argue that these are all icons that have a lot of power. These are icons. This is a farm that's been in the family for more than 100 years, and probably that barn in the back is 100 years old. Obviously, it carries a lot of history, carries a lot of emotions. 3 generations have lived there. In the front, you have a Chevy pickup, an American icon, 1972 Chevy pickup, still driving. If you were to zoom in, which we won't do now, but you'd see there's a U.S. Marine Corps decal on that. My father-in-law was in World War II. There are lightning rods above that he put up there, which to me represented resilience and resourcefulness. The electrical lines that you see were some that were hung probably in about 1946 after the war by his father. There was a time when he was a child when the barn burned down, thus the importance of the lightning rods. What you say, you have horses, you have grain bins, all of these things, seemingly commonplace things, but these all represent the way these people live, and they represent values, they represent ideas, and they don't even think about that, but it's just intertwined in their consciousness. And so all of this helps us to understand the next photograph, perhaps. So I have a new photograph, and we have another icon in the front. which is a Trump-Pence campaign sign. And so my sense was to understand what do these icons represent, and what is the interaction between this icon and all of the others, and why is it that these people are attracted? This isn't a value judgment, just trying to understand how these things symbiotically work together, representing the culture. And kind of the next one slide, I think, shows that, doesn't it? Yes. So what I see from that is, and all of these things, independence. These are people who are used for 150 years. They're used to doing their own thing, being left alone. They hate government interference. They appreciate strength. They see themselves as strong. They value resilience and perseverance. They're pragmatic. If something is broken, they fix it. They exist on the power of their experience. They do know how to do a lot of different things. They believe in the concept of manifest destiny, and that this is land. This is their land. This is their family has been on this for almost 150 years, and there's really a symbiotic relationship between the people and the land. Christianity is strong. Guns, they don't use guns to kill people, but they use guns to kill coyotes and what other varmints there might be threatening them. They have anger and angst, change going on. They have a lot of insecurity, things changing that they don't understand. Farming has changed, where one guy could farm 200 acres with a couple of significant pieces of machinery. Now a guy may farm thousands of acres with machinery that would cost more than your house. They have a lot of fear of other people, and they have a lot of fear of the future. So this isn't these are just the ideas to show you how these artifacts can represent and show a window into life experience. It's not to justify it, it's not to validate it, it's just to try to understand and explain it. So
one of the things I was talking to Jim about too was this is a great example of how there's different layers of narrative going on. I mean, at one level, we're talking about the individual narratives of these people that are in this location, but it also shows how there's a larger social narrative that is being discussed and being tapped into. And so just from this one photo, you can get into both personal and social narratives and look at the context within which both of those are happening.
Right, that's really powerful. So again, our camera, the filters that cover a researcher's lens, for me, personal values, attitudes, beliefs, formed by our own personal biographies, learned experiences. And so my question is, how does the introduction of that icon change one's perception of the scene? And you can just ask yourself rhetorically. I did present this at a conference, and it was pretty powerful. Once that icon was put up there, people were much less receptive to the kind of bucolic farm scene. So it was pretty powerful. So again, it's a lens. It's not a value judgment, good or bad, right or wrong. We just have to understand that these lenses filter how we perceive the world, and as Ryan said, individually, collectively, culturally. Okay.
So this example 3 is one of my dissertation students when I was working at another university. She conducted a study with combat veterans who had moral wounding and PTSD. And this was more of an expressive arts type of narrative project. In fact, she framed it as an intuitive inquiry. However, it had a very strong narrative component because the combat vets were actually going through a 5-week narrative therapy-based process. And so her study was looking at this process that they're going through, collecting those narratives, collecting all the drawings and paintings that they were doing as they recreated their story of their injury and their PTSD and how they were healing through that process. So there were visual narrative components, and she had a section, a vignette for each participant that included not only the imagery from their 5 weeks, but also a story of their change over those 5 weeks, and using their own words as she interviewed them. She also used statistical analysis because there were tests that were given pre-test and post-test that had to do with PTSD and a variety of other components, just to demonstrate that the program was working. You know, that was part of the programmatic piece that she was not associated with. She was just there as the researcher going in and collecting that data and demonstrating what that what the stories really told. The other thing that I want to point out is this was a great example of a transformative narrative perspective, because it showed the transformation not only of the vets as they engaged in this narrative therapy perspective, but also the healing of the researcher and the healing of the research process, because the researcher who was doing this had her own sexual trauma in her history, so she was able to relate their PTSD to her own PTSD, and that gave her a window into their healing process that was being told in their stories.
Ryan, if I could just add on, I really appreciate that, and I think that brought out a lot of key concepts for narrative. One, I think, is the dialogic between, and I don't mean to read into this study, but my perspective would be the dialogic between the researcher and the participants. You know, this can be purgative for both. It can be poignant and purgative and epiphonic for the participants. Sometimes people want to tell their story. I've recently had a couple of experiences, two different studies where people said, "Thank you for letting me tell my story, for asking." And for them, it can be purgative, it can be poignant, and epiphonic, come to insights that they didn't have before. And the same is dialogic, it's the same for the researcher as well. And honestly, if one is doing narrative and one is not touched by that, then I don't know, maybe you're not doing it right.
Yeah, I've found that in particular when listening to stories of voices on the edge, you know, whether it's minority or, you know, people that have had certain experiences that were considered not mainstream. Working in transpersonal psychology in particular, we hear a lot of stories of experiences that people have that wouldn't be accepted in some conversations, and asking them to tell their story and allow them to give voice to the experience that they have can be so cathartic, and they're very appreciative of just being able to tell somebody that they've had this experience.
Good. Cathartic, thank you. That's perfect. Perfect word. Yeah.
So some challenges and advantages to using narrative. You know, every method has its challenges and every method has its advantages, and these are just a few. Some of the challenges are you need to make sure and get a full story, so you need that depth. It's not simply just a description of an experience. You need to be able to go into that depth of that story. From an ethics perspective, IRBs, because narrative can be so open and flexible, and Schiff talks about this, sometimes that presents problems with IRBs who want very concrete steps, especially when it comes to analysis. And so being able to use verbiage that says how you're going to go through that analysis without locking yourself in is kind of key. Sometimes, because you're coming from a constructive worldview, sometimes it's difficult. People slip out of that worldview and they start making essentialist assumptions of their data, so you have to be careful of that. And also, you inhabit the stories of your participants. If you're working with something traumatic like PTSD, you know, childhood abuse, those different types of things that we see in psychology a lot, you need to have self-care in place, and you need to have some place you can process those stories yourself as a researcher. Otherwise, you know, you can end up getting burnt out, you know, sick, all sorts of, actually, I've seen this happen where somebody gets into those difficult stories, and as a dissertation student, they hit a wall and they shut down, and they're not able to matriculate through their program because they don't have a way of processing that. So it's important to have that and be able to work through that with your dissertation committee, with your own therapist, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't have to be psychology. I think that's a good point that transcends disciplines. And I'm glad you mentioned the IRB. Just very pragmatically, we had a research group where they are investigating bullying experienced in school administration. And the IRB, the University of Phoenix IRB, came back and said you need to show more specifically how you're going to account for whatever trauma these people may re-experience, and be able to counsel them or show them counseling or shut down or whatever. So if you're going to do something like this, you need to specifically consider the IRB implications and how you're going to address those possibilities.
Yeah, great. Some advantages: you get to hear people's stories. It can be quite exciting, and you can learn a lot from just hearing people's stories. The method is loose enough to make it your own, have your own style with it. You can include different artifacts to build the story. Rather than just having an interview, you can collect journals, pictures, as we saw before, visual art. You can have them make art or bring art that's important to them. And you can help give voice to those without. This can have a real social justice and advocacy flavor, which a lot of people like. All right, how do we tell narrative from other types of qualitative methods? This is kind of a framework only. Don't take this as stamped in concrete by any means. But in general, narrative is about telling people's story. For participant numbers, especially for those in the dissertation phase, you're looking 12 to 16, up to 20. And all of these numbers, participant numbers, Jim and I were thinking about the dissertation just to reflect that. For faculty that are doing this, you might have very different numbers for a variety of reasons. But 12 to 20 participants in narrative. Questions: tell me your story of your experience with. And the outcomes that you're going to get from this type of study, vignettes, meta-narratives, narratives, imagery, that type of thing, themes. Whereas ethnography, again, you get that Venn diagram overlap. You're looking at more of the cultural story. Describe the cultural experience, tell the story of engaging it with the cultural context. Again, possibly 12 to 16 or 20. How does the culture affect how this experience happens? Themes, understanding cultural components, the story of the experience in that culture would be the outcomes, that you're looking at in your chapters 4 and 5 or your results. Now, contrast that with something like phenomenology, where it's a really thick, rich description of a person's experience. You might only have 3 to 7 individuals in the study. Your question is, please describe your experience of, and you really need that depth. You might have multiple interviews with one individual just to get that thick description. And what you come out with is a description of the experience, and again, themes with that. Hermeneutics, you pull back a little bit. It's more about meaning making and how people make meaning of the experiences that they have. You tend to have more participants. You're asking about what was your meaning from that experience, how did you make meaning of it, how did you process it, and you come again with themes, characteristics, and understanding of the meaning making process. I just recreated narrative as that top one just so you could see. Grounded theory. You're moving from, are you moving into a process of discovering or developing theory or theoretical elements? You might have 18 to 16, or if you're on a homogeneous and looking at saturation. For a great discussion of this, I would recommend going back and listening to Dr. McCaslin's 2 different webinars. His description of grounded theory is just phenomenal. Go back and listen to those. But when it comes to homogeneous versus heterogeneous populations, the discussion around there really talks about that movement from having it's 8, as I said 18 to 16, I probably meant 8 to 16. but basically you're looking for saturation, that point at which you're getting the same type of information from your participants. But if you're going to heterogeneous, you need a much larger population, and you're talking about experience and process, and your outcome is more theoretical understanding. Case study, on the other hand, you're describing a case example, and you might have one bounded system or more, and be comparing those different bounded systems. And you're looking at those, what do those systems look like? What are the characteristics of those systems? How do things happen within those systems? What's the culture of those systems? And what output from that type of study are characteristics of the system or the case, potential comparisons, etc. Those are just a few of the other qualitative methods that we're contrasting narrative with. Jim, any additions there?
No, that's good, thanks.
And here are references that we used.
There we are. And we apologize, and I'll take responsibility. It's hard for me to get the APA format when I'm typing in the PowerPoint. So apologies.
This is our research methodology group on the research.phoenix.edu. You can go there, go into the special interest groups, go to research methodology, and we have a narrative inquiry page. On that page, we have a lot of these references as well. You can also go into the research methods webinars. If you see on the left-hand side, this is actually a snapshot of that website. And if you click on research methods webinars, that's where all the webinar recordings are, and you can listen to all the different methods recordings.
Yeah, and we encourage people to interact with that, with any of those groups. Have questions, post questions that we're interested in dialogue.
We are down to 4 minutes, but would love to receive questions.
Okay, I think we have been pretty quiet, no noise, so I encourage you to unmute yourself, ask a question, and then mute yourself. If you cannot unmute, maybe you are on the phone, but *5 unmute you, then put the question on the chat, and I am going to pass the question to Jim and Ryan. We're still recording.
I can unmute.
Okay, I can hear you.
Hello?
Dr. Sylvia, is that you? Do you want to ask a question?
No, I have a question, but it was not me. But I have a question, if you don't mind that I ask you. So actually, what I was wondering, if I want to do kind of a writing based on actually people's answers to specific questions, but the questions are open-ended, at least partially. So how would you say, what's the method for it? You gave me all these categories, and I'm not really very great in qualitative research. Even I took one class during my doctoral program, and I participated in one of their studies. But I myself have rather limited experience with qualitative research. So, so I'm wondering what that would be, if I would basically have questions, but ask the people actually in written form to answer them, instead of in verbal form and transcribing it. What's the method? I mean, in which category is that? To determine
survey research.
Survey? No, it's not a survey.
Well, it's qualitative survey research. It's not narrative unless you're really asking them. You could ask them to tell their story about engaging with or having a particular experience. But if it's a lot of different questions, some of which are closed-ended, you're probably moving into something that's like a qualitative survey method. Maybe hermeneutics, if you're looking at the meaning, looking at themes within their answers. But one of the difficulties with survey research is sometimes you don't get very deep or rich responses. And so it's hard to do an in-depth analysis, based on some of these methods like hermeneutics and.
I mean, the other problem is actually, I can share a little bit. I mean, it would relate to actually experiences of second or third generation Holocaust. And the problem I actually see, if you don't have questions, you may not have anything. And it's, I don't know, I mean, I was approached by a Jewish woman who wants to work with me on that. And kind of, we want to actually compare how the Jewish population experienced certain things compared to Austrian population. And since I'm speaking German, I can do the part in Austria. So kind of I agreed to the project even if it didn't come actually out of my own kind of research body. But she wanted to do it kind of without any research, kind of let's just interview people and write a book, And since I'm more having a scientific background, also she has a PhD too. Kind of, I was wondering how we could do it in a good way, to be not too strict, but to be somehow in a framework that we could compare these two cultures, or cultural experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost ethnography. I don't know, Jim, if you want to jump in here. I mean, that could be narrative or ethnography, but you'd want to maybe do more than survey. You might want to interview them and have a broader discussion with them.
Okay.
Jim?
Yeah, that specific topic reminds me Carolyn Ellis, who is a pioneer in autoethnography. It branched out into, I don't know what she calls it. It really is a kind of intense narrative. And anyway, she's taken as a project a man in his 90s that she met who is a Holocaust survivor. She spent a lot of time with him, interviewing him, and really doing a deep dive, and really just him telling his stories, and really not beginning with any kind of theoretical framework, although I just feel more comfortable having some kind of conceptual framework. But I will, I'll tell you, if you will send me an email, I will see if I can send you some work that Carolyn Ellis is doing in that regard. It may not be something, a route you would take, but you could see a way that a seasoned qualitative researcher is really doing a deep dive into that topic of Holocaust survivors. So just send me an email, jflane@email.phoenix.
No, the thing is also, since we are kind of having basically two languages,
yeah,
how we want to do that, I'm also a little hesitant to have only two people who tell their story. I still want to have some framework where we are able to compare that, or kind of, to contrast that. So kind of, I'm not sure how to do it in the best way.
So, I was just going to push the pause button here. We're getting into a little bit more in-depth questions about different types of qualitative research. Are there any questions about the narrative presentation we gave? Either Sylvia, and Sylvia, you're welcome to stay in touch with Jim and I, and we can keep the conversation going, because this is a great conversation. But I also want to give space for some of the students or other faculty that are here that have questions about narrative.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay. And you can email us. And actually, I think we're sending out a survey afterwards, aren't we? So they'll have another chance to respond.
Yeah.
I don't know who got that. I just sent my email address, but Ryan also has it. So.
Yes, I do. Yeah. Armando, were there any questions on the chat box? It doesn't look like it. All right. Anyone else?
I don't know. It's probably only me.
Well, we enjoyed it.
Yep. Well, if there are no other questions, I mean, thank you everyone for attending tonight. I know we wrap up technically 4 minutes ago, but thank you all for staying extra. I'll definitely stay on for a few more minutes if anybody wants to ask any other questions. But again, thank you everyone, and this recording will be available on the website along with all the other methodology webinars. Right.
I want to thank you. It was great. I really learned. I specifically like the categories because it made me think, you know, what I should be. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Glad you came.
Okay. Good night.